All right, here's a sim on the storage of audit documentation. We've got Lester CPA auditing Belfer Inc., a non-issuer, for the current year ended December 31st, 2020. For each numbered item, indicate whether the item should be stored in Lester CPA's 2020 current audit file, permanent file, or is not required to be stored in the 2020 audit documentation. So we'll just put an X in the column that it belongs. Number one, a flow chart of the internal control procedures. And number one would be the permanent file. Why? Because schedules, documents, and records with continuing audit significance for a specific client, they're stored in the permanent file. So a flow chart of the internal control procedures at the client company would have continuing audit significance, and therefore it would be stored in the permanent file. So let's place number one in the auditor's permanent file. Because next year and the year after, we'll pick up this flow chart out of the permanent file, and it's likely to still depict the internal control procedures. Number two, a copy of the client's debt agreements and bond indenture. So if Belfer Inc., the client, if they have a bond outstanding, then there's going to be a bond indenture that shows all of the important facts and obligations that Belfer has regarding this bond. One of those being when the interest payments are due, the dates of the interest payments, the amount of each interest payment, the stated rate of interest. And this would continue for as long as this bond is outstanding. Any other debt agreements, same thing. There could be what's called a debt covenant. So if there's a debt covenant in the debt agreement, this would require the client to maybe maintain a certain current ratio of, let's say, 1.5 to 1 current asset to current liability. And that would need to be stored in the permanent file because that's not changing anytime soon. The bank, the lender, expects the client to maintain that current ratio throughout the entire time that the debt is outstanding. Therefore, for number two, a copy of the client's debt agreements and bond indenture, put an X in the permanent file. To number three we go, a copy of the financial statements. So the client's financial statements for the current year, where's that going? Right into the current file, because that relates to the current year under audit. What else would we expect to put into the current file? Schedules, analyses that relate to the current year under audit, like results of substantive tests, such as confirmations that we sent out and inventory observations that we made. Test counts, if we did them when we observed the inventory, that would go in the current file also. Number four, the client's organization chart. And that would go in the permanent file because the client's organization chart would be a useful tool on continuing audit engagements since the lines of authority are not expected to change. What goes in the permanent file are schedules, documents, and records with continuing audit significance for that specific client. What else would go in the permanent file would be things like articles of incorporation, the company's bylaws, any long-term leases and contracts, all would go in the permanent file along with the organization chart. Number five, difficulty in applying necessary auditing procedures, such as lack of responsiveness of the client. And of course, that'll go into the current file because the current file will include such analysis that relates to the current year under audit. Number six, a list of alternative procedures that were considered but not used in the audit. And the answer is that's not required to be documented. So if you considered certain procedures but did not use them, that's not required documentation. That wouldn't have to go in the current file or the permanent file. Number seven, an indication that the accounting records agree or reconcile with the financial statements. And that would be in the current file because that would be a schedule or analysis that you made that relates to the current year under audit. And that's an important moment in an audit when you've determined that the accounting records agree or reconcile with the financial statements. that belongs in the current file. Number 8, copies of lease agreements and employee stock option plans. And that would be in the permanent file because that's a schedule, a document, or a record with continuing audit significance for that specific client. That lease agreement will span a number of years, and the stock option plans will be relevant to next year's audit and the following year as well. And if this were to have said pension plan, permanent file as well. Number 9, the basis for conclusions about all relevant assertions. Well, I can't think of anything more important than that to put in the current file, because that would include substantive procedures performed, such as confirmations, inventory observation and test counts, results of your two-directional testing for vouching and tracing. That's how you would base your conclusion about relevant assertions, such as completeness, existence, occurrence. So definitely number 9 in the current file. Number 10, the manner in which management considered trivial errors discovered in the audit. And that would not require our documentation because they're trivial errors. So the manner in which management considered those trivial errors that we found is not required for us to document. If those were major errors, then of course the current file. If those were major errors, then the manner in which management considered those errors that we discovered, that we'd put in the current file. 11, the analysis of asset accounts and their related expense or income accounts that appear on the same work paper. And this would be the current file. Now, what would be an example of an asset account and its related expense? How about prepaid insurance and insurance expense? You might analyze those accounts on the same working paper, and that analysis would be stored in the current file. Number 12, the management representation letter. And of course, the management rep letter goes in the current file because that is the last piece of evidence regarding this year's audit opinion, where we ask management to sign off on all the inquiries that we made to them, where they responded to our inquiries orally. We put it down on paper and presented it back to them and say, hey, here's your answers to our questions. Would you please sign that you still believe that your answers are truthful and correct? So definitely remember that the management rep letter gets stored in the current file. 13, analysis of capital stock and owner's equity accounts. And this will be stored in the permanent file, much like what we saw with the debt agreements. Capital stock and owner's equity accounts are long-term in nature, and they would impact continuing audit engagements, not just this year. 14, documentation that the audit was adequately planned and supervised. And that would certainly belong in the current file. You need to have that documented, especially if you ever get sued. You want to show due diligence that you adequately planned and supervised this engagement. 15, significant audit findings that could result in modification of the auditor's report. And of course, this will be in the current file. Some type of analysis or schedule that relates to the current year under audit would be stored in the auditor's current file. So this could relate to substantive tests that you performed that didn't work out the way you expected them to, and you wound up having to change the audit report from what you thought you were going to issue to what you ended up having to issue. Maybe it led you to add an emphasis of matter paragraph, but since that relates to the current year audit, it would be stored in the current file. 16, prior year's accounts receivable confirmations that were classified as exceptions in the 2019 audit. Now, this is the 2020 audit. It tells us in the instructions. So what do we do with prior year's accounts receivable confirmations? They're asking us about confirmations sent out in last year's audit that came back as exceptions in last year's audit. We're not required to document that in this year's audit. Last year, that would have been in the current file of last year's audit. But this year, that's not an item with continuing significance. So those are not carried forward, those exceptions to last year's accounts receivable confirmations. So no requirement to document that in the 2020 audit documentation. All right, number 17, working trial balances and lead schedules. What the heck are they? They're going to be in any audit documentation question that you'll see on a CPA exam. Working trial balances and lead schedules are stored in the current file because they relate to this year's audit. What are they? A working trial balance is used to record the year-end ledger balances of all the accounts prior to the audit. So the auditor takes the client's year-end balances and makes a working trial balance starting with those balances, and then makes reclassifications and adjustments on the working trial balance. So after the first two columns of the working trial balance being debits and credits consisting of the ending balances that the client's reporting, after that there'll be columns in the middle for reclassifications and adjustments on the working trial balance, and that'll lead the auditor to the final audited balance. And since that relates to the current year audit, that's stored in the current file. All right, what's a lead schedule? A lead schedule is the audit document that reflects the major components of one amount reported on the financial statements. For example, the client's cash balance. All the client's cash accounts are summarized on a single schedule known as a lead schedule for cash. The client might have 6 cash accounts, and they'd all be summarized on a lead schedule for cash, and this amount should tie in to the cash balance on the financial statements. And that's why this lead schedule, along with the working trial balance, would be stored in the current file. Number 18, the articles of incorporation and bylaws. That'll always be stored in the permanent file because that relates to continuing audits. They have continuing audit significance. The articles of incorporation is evidence that the company actually did incorporate and the state that it actually incorporated in. So you'll copy the articles of incorporation and you'll keep it in the permanent file. The bylaws are the rules for governing the corporation, and they're adopted usually by either the incorporators or the first meeting of the board of directors. So they're very permanent in nature, and that's why that would be stored in the permanent file. So make sure to review this sim before your exam, and you'll be ready to go for audit documentation.